Welcome, everyone. We want to thank the Jewish Book Council for making today possible. I also want to thank Ruth Seif and Barbara Sonnies, our co-chairs of our Vesters book programs. We are so lucky to have B.A. Shapiro with us this morning, who's going to speak about her book Metropolis, which I hope you've all read. If you haven't, please pick it up at your favorite local bookstore or through our WHC Mitzvah Mall, which supports WHC's social justice efforts. During our program, if you have any questions you'd like me to pose to Barbara, to our author, please send them to me privately in the chat so that we don't distract her as she's answering our other questions. But what an absolute pleasure to welcome B.A. Shapiro. She is an award-winning New York Times best-selling author of 9 novels, including Metropolis and The Collector's Apprentice and The Art Forger, which won the New England Book Award for Fiction, among other honors. Her books have been selected as community reads throughout the country and have been translated into over a dozen languages. She holds a PhD in sociology from Tufts University and has directed research projects for a residential substance abuse facility, worked as a systems analyst and statistician, headed the Boston office of a software development firm, and served as an adjunct professor teaching sociology at Tufts University and creative writing at Northeastern University. She loves writing novels, best of all. Barbara splits her time between Boston and Naples, Florida, and we are so lucky to have her with us today. And let's begin. So welcome, Barbara. I'm so excited to talk with you again. And so excited to talk about this book that I just loved getting the chance to read. So I'm going to start with the most open-ended question possible, which is, what inspired you to write this story?
That has to be the first question everybody asks.
It has to be. It has to be.
And it seems like it would be an easy question to answer, but it actually is more complicated. I think this is true of most writers, but it's definitely true of me, is that it's not one event that creates the idea for a book. And it's not like one moment when all of a sudden you see the whole book and you just go and write it. Or maybe that happens to some people. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen to me. So this book in particular was about 30 years in the making.
Wow.
I first had the idea until I started writing it. So as you just heard, I have a PhD in sociology. And when I was in graduate school, I was taking a seminar class on social class, which I've always been really interested in. And one of the things so at that time, we saw a movie. Now you can just go onto YouTube and see it. And it is, for those of you who have read the book, basically what Marta is writing her doctoral dissertation on. And so, excuse me. So the basis of this is a game. And the game is that, to say everybody in this group here today was lined up to run a race. And whoever wins $100. But before you start, you have to answer a series of questions. If you answer the questions yes, you take a step forward. If you answer the questions no, you stay where you are. And these questions are things like, you had more than 20 books in your home when you were growing up. You never had to worry about helping your parents pay the rent. You felt that you were safe walking around in your neighborhood when you were growing up. And there are about 25 of these. And everybody answers the question. And after they're over, if you turn and look around, you see that the starting line is not the same for everyone else. That those people who responded yes to these questions were more fortunate, more privileged. Their parents came from higher socioeconomic levels. And the idea is not that somebody who's at the back can't win if they run really fast, or somebody at the front won't lose because they stumble and fall. The idea is that just as I said, the starting line is not the same for all of us. So I was really struck by this because this isn't the usual, the usual American pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing, but it rang really true to me. And so I was in graduate school and was going to be a sociologist, and I had no thought of writing novels at that time. But I thought this would be such a fun thing to write a novel about. So I kind of scribbled it down and I went home and I started a file, which is very cleverly called Novel Ideas. And I put the idea in the file and went along with my life. Did become a sociologist. And then I read the book, God, what's the name of the book? The one where the guy's walking between the Twin Towers. Yeah, not there. And
Come when you're not thinking of it.
What's the book?
I said it'll come when you're not thinking of it.
Yes, it will. And basically it's this story. So there's an event. The guy is walking between a tightrope between the Twin Towers. And it's the story of all of these different people who are there or are affected by it, who have nothing to do with each other. They never have known each other. They would never have crossed paths ordinarily, but because of this event, they do. And I thought, God, that would be a really fun thing to write about, about the what happens when people, we all live in our little echo chambers. What happens when we step out of the echo chambers and we start to interact with people who are very different from us? So dropped it in the novel's idea file, kept going. Then I saw the film.
The Walk.
Pardon?
It was called The Walk. The film was, at least.
No, the film was called Finding Vivian Maier. It was a documentary about this woman who was, completely bizarre and insanely talented. And she lived in Chicago in the 1950s, and she was usually a nanny. Some people thought that she was wonderful. Other people thought she was a witch. Other people thought, all kinds of different things about her. But she had a reflex camera that you look down into, a Rolleiflex, and she went around wearing black and trailing, her kids behind her. And she took photos of people in their real lives who didn't know they were being photographed. And she felt that this is where you get the full person, who they really, really are, when they're not trying to, put a smile on their face or be anybody who they're not. And she took thousands and thousands of these amazing photographs, both of people like that, and then also of situations without people, that somehow all of these, not only was it about what you were looking at, but it touched on a universal truth about who we are and how we present ourselves. And I was so taken with this. I said, I got to write a book about Vivian Maier. So dropped it in the novel's idea file and kept going. So then I did become a novelist, and I had written by that time I had written 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I had written 9 novels, only 4 of which had actually gotten published. And and then I'm getting lost in my own story here. Then I wrote 3 books that suddenly were successful, and my whole life changed. And they were all about art, and there was a mystery in them, and they jumped back in time, and they were historical novels. And I decided I wanted to write something different. So I went through my novel's idea file, and there was nothing there. And so I'm walking around the house. Oh, poor me. I can't come up with another idea. I've got a contract. What am I going to do? And then I read an article in the Boston Globe, and it was about this self-storage facility, which sat in Cambridge, right across from MIT. And it was this big, giant brick monstrosity that looked kind of like a medieval castle. And it was a storage facility. It was over 100 years old. And people were moving out because MIT had bought it for to turn into dorms, which was a dumb idea, seeing as how there were no windows. But anyway, there were pictures of this storage facility and all of this motley crew of people, and an even more motley crew of things, and that they were moving out. So there's everything from very, very wealthy people with, you know, somebody helping them to load up their wine collection, and then really poor people who are dragging out old mattresses. And all of a sudden it was like, wait a second, I could do something with this is a place where people of all socioeconomic levels could be. They could start to interact with each other, even though they never knew each other before. And one of them could be a photographer, just like Vivian Mayer. And so, aha. So this book actually came from 4 different events. The graduate school story, the novel, the film, and then a newspaper article over 30 years.
What a wonderful story to frame this kind of magical opportunity that you created here for us to see this intersection of all of these different socioeconomic backgrounds that so rarely actually intersect, right? They, especially so many altogether. And as you mentioned, there's an art element to all of your novels. And I know that you are a passionate art lover and love the opportunity to share your love and knowledge about art through your works. And I was so drawn in reading the descriptions of the photography throughout this novel. So I'm curious what your own background is with art, and now we have a little idea about the inspiration for this particular photographer character, or at least the photography itself, and that the type of photography that he does. But I'd love to hear more about your relationship with art and why it's so important that you include it in all of your novels.
Well, when I was a little girl, I wanted to be an artist. And my parents were very supportive. My father set up a little studio for me in a corner of the basement. And my mother took me to the local museum for art classes. But unfortunately, it became clear really early on that this is not where my talents lay. So I became an art appreciator. And I travel a lot, and wherever I go, the first thing that I do is go to an art museum. And I have no training as an artist. I have no training as an art historian. But so that the Art Forger was about forging oil paintings and somewhat about the Impressionists. The Muralist was about the abstract expressionists. The Collector's Apprentice was about the post-impressionists. And then this one is about photography. So I figure I actually, over the course of writing these books, have given myself a master's degree in art history.
That sounds about right. Sounds about right. I would say you have quite a deeper understanding than the average Joe, for sure. And it shows in the way that you describe it.
Yes.
I also, when we got a chance to speak before, you talked a lot about it. You talked a lot about sort of the news that was happening in the moment as being a piece of the inspiration for Marta and her story. And I'm curious about that particular inspiration for this particular moment. I'm also curious about that, how the news affects you as a writer in general when you're working on a novel. Does it often play into what you're writing, or was this more of a specific thing that was weighing on you and therefore you needed to include it?
Yeah, it all weighs on me all the time. So in terms of Marta, so when I came up with the idea, then I said, well, who would have units in the storage facility? And I wanted some people who lived there, which does happen. It's completely illegal, but it's not as uncommon as you might think. And so I made a list of who might and who might not live there. And one of the ideas for a person who might live there was somebody who was hiding from ICE. And so I thought, okay, that makes sense. And who is she? And then I wanted to bring in the race of life piece. And I thought, okay, she could be there. And she was a student in graduate school at Tufts University in sociology. And she was writing her dissertation on the race of life. So that was the original inspiration. And then I did all of this research into the whole immigration and ICE issues, which were, and Venezuela. I decided she was going to be from Venezuela because that was also in the news at the time. And it just really gripped me about what was happening and the things that were so unfair with the system. And I talked many times with a lawyer, an immigration lawyer in Boston, and she really helped me with the details. And then she read over the chapters and told me what was right and wrong. And then I named the judge in the book after her, Susan Cohen. And yeah, the news does affect me. My editor is quite gun shy about getting too involved in the news, but I do manage to slip it in there all the time.
So this is not a Jewish story by any means.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a Jewish character,
and there's me,
and you are a Jewish author, and so I actually am curious, the way that you relate to these kinds of news stories, right? Your concern about Venezuela and ICE and mental health issues and lack of care and lack of understanding, and your sociology background, race of life. Do your Jewish values, does your Jewish perspective feed into your relationship with those things and your understanding of them?
Oh, definitely. I was raised in a Jewish home, and politics were very important. And it was a discussion all the time of what was going on, what was fair, what wasn't fair, what people were doing that were hurting other people versus how you could help other people. And that value of thinking about people who you don't know, who are less well off than you, and their difficulties and what you can do to make them better off. So, like, for example, with this book, so Marta, back to Marta, it was like, okay, try and understand this from the viewpoint of someone who is going through something that you're not going through. And the whole race of life thing, it's like the social strata in this country and the difference between what is available to the wealthier versus what's available for the poorer is horrible. And this is something that I'm very concerned with. And, I mean, you give money, but there's not all that much that I can do about the inequalities. So writing a book about them. And so I tried really hard not to make it like screaming in your head, look at the inequities in America. I wanted it to be more subtle so that people wouldn't reject it right away, and that once they got to know each of the characters, that maybe they would start to appreciate how unfair it is that that Lydia's husband gets away with everything, and Serge and Serge and Rose don't, which has nothing to do with who they are. I mean, basically what the Race of Life says is that you get a step up because of something that has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with how smart you are. It has nothing to do with your talents. It has nothing to do with your perseverance. You get a step up because of something that you had no control over, which is to whom you were born. So that's what I try to do in all my books, that there are elements of that. I have written more Jewish books. The Muralist is a very Jewish book, and the book I'm working on now is also a pretty Jewish book. So it's always in there. Mm.
Absolutely. It's part of who you are, and this is your art. So who you are is going to come through.
Also based on just something I had no control of, to whom I was born.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As we all are.
They all are. And I will say, as someone who similarly based on my own Jewish values and my own Jewish upbringing, think about these things in a very similar way. None of it felt preachy to me. So kol hakavod for that. None of it felt preachy or like I was being hit over the head with it. It just was all of these stories, and the way that they wove together and intersected. So I'm going to ask one more question of my own before we open it up to questions from the group, which is just, again, when we spoke before, you talked about writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting to find the right combination of characters and how to weave all of their stories together. And I was so moved by each of the stories individually, but so curious about the puzzle of how they were all going to come together throughout. And I wonder what your process is as you're piecing all of that together and creating this puzzle and solving it at the same time.
Yeah, well, this book was particularly difficult on that level, obviously. But so one of my areas of specialization in sociology was statistics. And so I use statistical methods to write my books. You probably don't know, unless you've heard me speak before, that every plot and every subplot and every character arc follows a normal curve, which can be broken up into 4 different segments, referring back to the 4 acts of a story. And I write out charts. I have a whole bunch of normal, actually, I should have pulled them out. I could show you normal curves for the main plot, each subplot, each character. And so in the case of Metropolis, there were, maybe 24 different normal curves. And so on the bottom line is time in the novel. And then each one in the middle is the main turning point that happens in each person's story or happens in the plots. And I chart out the events of each person's story, and doing it on the normal curve line really helps me see how this fits in the book. So the characters. So I had the 6 different characters. Actually, I started with 7 and one got lost. The 6 different
I
characters.
asked who that character was, that 7th character.
The character that wasn't there got kicked out by my editor, actually by my publisher. But I'll finish this story and then I can tell you that story. So I have all of these different normal curves, and then I take a big one and put all of the different stories on them so that I can see where in time each one is going to go. And I also keep all kinds of charts. I have bubblegrams looking at the relationship between all of the different characters. So, for example, when I started, Rose was the only one who really knew all the other characters. And by the time I ended, it was all these complicated relationships. But that helped me see right from the beginning, even though all the characters in my head were equal in terms of time and story, that Rose was really the center of the book, which made me realize that if she was starting it, she also had to have a really important part in ending it. I also keep charts about the amount of tension in each scene as I write. So I have tension charts. This I have for the book I'm working on now. And what every scene I give a tension coefficient. And so you can't have a scene with no tension in it because the reader's just going to put the book down. But sometimes you have to have scenes that don't have as much tension in them. They're coming off, they're coming down from a very big scene, or it is a character reflecting on what happened, or maybe a scene from the past. So I give those scenes a tension coefficient of 0.25. Then there are scenes where you have more tension, or in the case of this book, where more of the characters started interacting with each other. So if there was more going on and more characters, and it felt pretty solid, that got a 0.50. But if there's a scene where there are lots of characters, they're interacting and they're also creating a lot of plot movement, that's 0.75. And then the major scenes, which correspond back to the 4 acts of the book, get the big 1.0. So after I've done the normal curve charts, then I use a very sophisticated statistical method that you probably, none of you, unless you're statisticians, will understand, but I'll tell you about it anyway. I use multicolored file cards. And the multicolored file cards correspond, I take the normal curves, and each character in each plot has a different color card. So, for example, Rose had maybe 20 major plot points. So I used red cards for her because her name was Rose, and each of her major plot points got 20 different red cards. Then I went to Marta, and she had maybe 30 different major plot points. So I gave her green cards. See, these are the fun things you do to amuse yourself that nobody ever knows about. And I put all of hers. And then I did that with all of the characters. And then I did that with all of the main plots. And then I lay them out on my dining room table and try to make them work within the 4-act structure. And, so for a few days, I'm walking around the table and I have extra cards and I pull cards out and I throw them on the ground. And I try to create situations where the stories are coming together in multiple ways. And then I take that stack of cards and that's what I write from. Then I write the first draft, which is the part that I find the most painful. And then I do 6 or 7 major rewrites. So right now in the book I'm writing, I'm on phase 2 of draft 2. And so draft 2 will probably have 3 phases before I move on to draft 3. So this book took me about 4 years to write, which is usually 3 to 4 years is what it takes me, because you know, I like to do the research, which takes time, and I like to challenge myself. So like this book was a big challenge, but it was also really fun. It was really fun to write.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And I think the only other piece, well, the piece of our conversation that's missing from this is what a love letter to your city this is.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've been living in Boston since I moved up there to go to graduate school. And I've lived in many different neighborhoods. Some are the neighborhoods that the characters live in. And you know, that's the thing that I love about Boston, is that it's a little city made up of so many different neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods have such personality in and of themselves, which also reflects back onto, you know, the socioeconomic part of it. So yeah, Boston.
Absolutely. The city built on cow paths.
Yep, yep, and landfill and cow paths.
So we have a question someone sent in to me about the audiobook version of this. And they were wondering, do you think at all about how you write for the sake of an audiobook, for the sake of making it attractive to Audible and things like that? Is that at all a factor in your process, or are you thinking more just about sort of the world that you're creating?
To me, it's, even though I listen to audiobooks all the time, and I love them, when I'm writing, I imagine my reader, and he or she, usually she, is sitting up in bed at night reading, and she's got to go to work the next day or do all kinds of stuff. And my job is to keep her awake. And when people tell me, I was really mad at you because, you know, I didn't go to bed until after 2 o'clock the other day reading your book. And I'm like, yes, that's what I want. So my image is always of somebody reading the book. The audio piece, well, this book was the first book that I had multiple readers for. And so each of the 6 characters has a different reader, which and so they gave, it's kind of funny, they gave me a choice. They sent me, you know, little audition things for each of the 6 characters, like 3 of them. And I listened to them, and none of them sounded like the character in my head. I'm not sure what the characters actually sound like, but I knew it wasn't any of these people. So I chose the best one that I thought did it. And I said, no accents, definitely, unless you have somebody who grew up working class in Boston, no fake Boston accents, because they're awful. And they said, okay, fine. And then they came back and they said, well, we found a Venezuelan woman. Would that accent be okay? I'm like, that's great. You know, that would be perfect as long as it's real. So it's an odd thing, the audiobook, and I always make myself listen to it, and it always makes me uncomfortable. You know, it's like, even though I listen to them all the time.
I imagine that Rose, as you were writing her, had a pretty thick
Yeah,
Boston accent.
she did, but nobody does a Boston accent well unless they grew up.
It's true. It's true. You can't.
It
I've
just,
never heard a good fake Boston accent
no,
ever.
no.
I certainly can't do it, and I lived there for 5 years.
I've lived there. I've lived there for 40 years, and I can't do it.
I want to actually invite our co-chairs of this book program, Ruth or Barbara. Would you like to ask any questions? I just want to invite that in case. Ruth, there we go. Let's see if we can hear you.
I don't have any. I'm glad that the cantor did address the fact that, because I was wondering, how did this get into the Jewish Book Council? And but I knew you were Jewish from the name, and that was I'm glad that that was addressed, because I was wondering about that also myself.
Well, the Jewish Book Council is, the books either have to have Jewish content or have a Jewish author. So that's that's the major criteria. And then your publisher submits, tons of copies and money and all kinds of stuff. And then, well, it used to be really fun, because there was a big meeting in New York. People from Jewish book councils all over the country and JCCs, and we'd go in. This part was harder because you had 2 minutes to pitch your book, and that was it. And you're up on stage. Well, it's actually a bima in a synagogue, and there are 50, they do it 50 people at a time. Usually there are about 250 authors that do it. And you're alphabetical, and there's a woman sitting in front of the bima, and she's got cards, and she's got 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds. And you have to pitch it, and then it's like, okay, Schwartz, you're up. Shapiro, you're on deck. Schmidt. It's crazy. And then the people at the communities decide which books they want. So, like, I've done dozens of these with Metropolis, even though it's not. I think a lot of people like to do a variety of different books. Although there was one that told me they really wanted me to come, but it didn't have enough Jewish content, so they didn't. So it's kind of a, that's how they do it.
But and also it was just interesting to see how this developed, and how, like the cantor pointed out, your Jewish values came into it, and inequalities and all that, and how it's just different for different people. So it made me like the book even more, and I loved it before. So it's really good to hear, always good to hear the author speak, and I enjoyed that.
I think this wasn't necessarily a question that came in, but a comment about the many ethical quandaries that your characters had to face, and especially Rose's decision to go to Garrett and accept his help and the cost of that. How did you think about all of the ethical quandaries that you posed to your characters throughout this?
Well, I actually really like ethical quandaries. And I think especially when they're balanced. So Rose, as a mother, was terrified about her son, getting killed. And but she also, Rose has faults, like we all do, but she also has good sides. And she really likes Liddy, and she wants in her own way to be a good person. So she had to balance, the concern for her son with her concern for her friend, and knowing that this was going to destroy her. And that's when you have a decision for a character that is balanced, where the reader can see the character going either way. That to me is a good dilemma. Like, if a car is racing towards your kid and you jump in to grab the kid, that's not a dilemma. You just do that. But this, where she was assuming it would help her kid and she knew it would hurt her friend is more of an interesting dilemma. And so that's what I like to do. Those things don't happen in the early drafts. Those things for me happen much later on, where sometimes I can, where suddenly I go, that would make that work. Okay.
So you have to kind of live with the characters and their stories for a while before you can start to write those kinds of decisions for them.
Yeah, it's also that. So I wrote the first draft of the book I'm working on now, which is called Six Lunatics, One of Which is a Woman. And which is a direct quote from somebody in the late 19th century about one of the early Impressionist shows. And so it took me about a year to do the first draft. And so first draft is a series of multiple rewrites, but to get to the end of that. And then I sat down and read the whole thing and took notes, and I had notes from when I was working on the first draft, took notes, and then sat down and wrote the first half of the second draft. And doing that, I realized that the balance between the past story and the present story wasn't right. And that the present story wasn't working as well as the past story. So I did what I could in the first phase of the second draft. And then I just finished reading the whole first phase of the second draft. And then I realized why. Wasn't until just reading it the other day that I realized why the present story wasn't working. And that was because the main character in the present story didn't change, which is something that, I teach writing, and I say you have to do this all the time. So, it's like going on 2 years, and I finally figured that out. So each one of these iterations, you see new things. And like the Rose thing wasn't in there originally because the person who ratted Lydia out in the first version is the character who got thrown on the cutting room floor. So
will you tell us a little bit about that character? We've had a couple of questions. We're all curious.
Okay, so that character was an artist, and she was doing found art. I don't know if you know what that is, but people find things and then they put them together in innovative ways and do different things. And she was a poor Black woman who lived in projects and had a wayward son. And she had won a contest. And if she handed in, a prize winning piece, then she would get shown at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, and she would get to go to school, and she would be able to pull herself and her son out of poverty. And she did all that. Actually, there's one scene in the book that's still there from her. And she created this thing with dominoes in her storage unit. And she also did something with films. I had created all of these different found art pieces that I thought were really cool. And when I handed in, must have been like the third or fourth draft to my editor, she said, "You can't do this." She said, "The critics are going to just skewer you. They are going to say that you are appropriating a poor Black woman's life, and you, as a wealthier white woman, can't do that." And they'll say, "No, this is, you can't create this character." And I said, "I don't care." And she said, "Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm telling you that this is going to be a major problem." So I have a cousin who married a Black man, and he was helping me with the Black characters. And so obviously I talked to him about it. And and then my son works with a lot of Black rap artists, and they both said, you know, if you don't want to do it, keep her, but it will be a problem. And so I, you know, took one for the team. And then it turned out that it was better that it was Rose who actually stepped in and ratted Liddy out to Garrett, because that kept the story closer together. So even though I missed that character, it turned out to be the best thing. Although this stuff is going on all over the place in publishing and in all kinds of things. You know, I'm a novelist, and what a novelist does is you make up stuff and you create characters and you create worlds that are different from you. And so, like I said to my editor, I said, so am I only allowed to write about older, upper middle class, overeducated Jewish women? It's nobody's interested in that, you know. And she said, no, it's not that bad, but they're very, very afraid of the few people, the tail ends, both tail ends, who are going to get online and on social media and skewer people for making up stuff, you know. So anyway, that's sad saga, but it did have a happy ending.
I love hearing about all of the twists and turns of this creative process.
There are many.
And some of them are joyful discoveries, and some of them are painful losses, and
usually both.
They often go hand in hand, right? We, as Jews, we know that the joyful and the painful so often coexist in the same thing.
Yep.
And we hold multiple truths constantly, and that comes through in
that's
the art.
what intelligent people know.
True.
And
absolutely true. It's
truth.
simply baked into Jewish culture.
Yes.
It's baked into Jewish culture, and many other wise people know it as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then there are a lot who don't. But that's a whole other story.
That's a whole other conversation that we sadly did not have time for today. I would love to ask you one more question, and then I believe we have a few announcements from Barbara Sonnies before we can wrap up. But someone asked about in your writing process, how do you decide whether you're going to write in the first person or the third person? Right.
Sometimes it changes. I mean, in different drafts, I have written third person or first person and then switched it around. I either write in first person or very close third person. And so you can have a third person that's out here, or you can have a third person that's very close. And so even my third person people are very close to the first person. The third person people are close to the first person. Sometimes I'll write it in one or the other and it will feel wrong. Or sometimes it just, the voice comes to me like that. I also generally write in the present tense, which is unusual. Most people write in the simple past. And so like the book I'm working on now, I have, it jumps from present day back to the late 19th century. And so logically, I thought I would put the 19th century half of the book in simple past tense and the present in present tense. But so I started writing it that way, and I just felt those people in the present tense. So now, you know, but the character in the present is in first person, and everyone in the past is in third person.
Oh, interesting. And that may change in another draft. We'll find out.
It could. You know, that is, so it's actually quite easy to change from the first person to the third person. Actually, I have had third person characters that I changed to first person just for myself. Because when you're writing in first person, you're behind the eyes of the character, and you only see and you only think what they are seeing and thinking. Third person is a little bit wider, and so you can, you're a little bit distant from the character, and then if you move into like omniscient, you're completely distant. But I find that the first person gives me more insights into who the character is and how they're actually thinking. And then it's very easy to flip back to the third person. Going from third person to first person is very hard.
Interesting.
It's much harder.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much. I could keep peppering you with questions about your writing and about this particular book forever. And I'm so excited do you have a timeline yet for this next book that you're working on? You're probably in relatively early stages still.
Yeah, except that they want it right away. So that's another story I could tell you.
Well, I think we all want it too. So we look forward to reading more from you and hearing more from you. And we're so grateful to the Jewish Book Council for making this possible, and so grateful to you for making the time for us.
Yeah.
What a pleasure and what an absolute gift to get to hear some extra insights behind what created this beautiful novel. And I'm so grateful that the Jewish Book Council said yes to this particular book and that we got to read and discuss it this way.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, especially to our co-chairs, Ruth Seif and Barbara Sonis, and thank you so much, Barbara Shapiro, for being with us today. What a gift and what a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you all. And happy reading and happy next book groups.